Imagine a prisoner so feared that officers spoke his name only in whispers. A man whose violent past stretched across states, whose cold stare made even hardened criminals step aside. For years, he sat behind thick steel doors, hidden from the world, but never forgotten. Everyone knew he was dangerous. No one knew how far he would go. Then came the night that changed everything. During a late-night police transfer, routine became deadly. In the back of a transport van, the prisoner waited, silent, calculating, watching every move. And in a split second, chaos erupted. A struggle, a shout, a fatal blow. Within moments, a police officer lay dead, and the man the system thought it had under control slipped into the darkness without hesitation. Panic spread across the county. Sirens echoed through empty roads. Officers scrambled, helicopters roared awake, and neighborhoods locked their doors. Because this wasn't just an escape. This was a killer on the loose, a man who had already taken a life and had nothing left to lose. This is the chilling story of how one of America's most dangerous prisoners murdered a police officer, and then vanished, turning the entire nation into his hunting ground. Long before the escape, long before the officer's death, the story of this dangerous prisoner began in the forgotten cracks of America's underbelly. His name was Elias Ward, but on the streets he was known simply as Reaper, a nickname he earned before he was even old enough to drive. Violence wasn't something he learned, it was something that lived inside him. And by the time he reached adulthood, that violence had turned into a reputation so terrifying that even gangs refused to work with him. Elias grew up in a home ruled by chaos. His father was absent, his mother struggled with addiction, and the neighborhood around him was a breeding ground for crime. At age 13, he was arrested for the first time. At 15, he stabbed a man during a robbery gone wrong. At 19, he committed the murder that made him a statewide threat. Witnesses described him not as angry or panicked, but calm, eerily calm, as if taking a life meant nothing at all. Police officers who arrested him said he smiled during questioning, a cold, unsettling smile that hinted at something darker. A court psychologist later said Elias displayed complete emotional detachment, high intelligence, and an unusual tolerance for pain. In other words, he was unpredictable, unbreakable, and nearly impossible to control. When he entered the prison system, the chaos didn't stop. It escalated. Elias attacked 2 inmates within his first week. He broke a guard's nose during a routine search. He learned the routines of officers, memorized the sound of every lock, and observed weaknesses with precision. He wasn't just surviving prison, he was studying it. Every hallway, every shift change, every security flaw became part of a mental blueprint he carried with him. Despite multiple warnings from staff, higher authorities underestimated him. "He's dangerous, but manageable," one administrator wrote in a report. It was a mistake that would cost lives. Over the next few years, Elias was moved through several facilities, each time causing new problems. In one prison, he orchestrated an assault on a rival inmate using nothing but coded notes. In another, he staged a fake medical emergency just to test emergency response procedures. Officers began requesting reassignment whenever they were assigned to his block. His prison file grew thicker every year, filled with violence, manipulation, escape attempts, and behavioral red flags. Yet somehow, through staffing shortages, bureaucratic delays, and overcrowded institutions, Elias kept slipping through disciplinary cracks. He became the kind of prisoner no one wanted to handle, but someone always had to. Eventually, he was transferred to a maximum security unit where inmates spent most of their time in isolation. But even there, Elias found opportunities. He gained the trust of weaker inmates, manipulated guards with psychological tricks, and slowly built a reputation as the most dangerous man behind those concrete walls. Still, he waited. Because Elias knew something most inmates didn't. True escape wasn't about breaking out of a cell. It was about breaking out at the right moment. And that moment would come during a late-night transfer, on a lonely stretch of road, with two officers who had no idea they were transporting a man who had been preparing for this night his entire life. The system thought it could contain him. It couldn't. The night of the escape began like any other routine transfer. Quiet, unremarkable, and rushed. It was past midnight, the hour when most of the world sleeps and even the sharpest minds begin to dull. But Elias Ward was wide awake. He had been awake for days, replaying every detail of this transfer in his head. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was the moment he had been waiting for. A staffing shortage forced the prison to send only 2 officers for the transport instead of the mandatory 4. Officer Hale, a veteran with 18 years on the job, sat in the passenger seat reviewing documents. Officer Bennett, younger and less experienced, drove the van through a stretch of rural highway where trees swallowed the moonlight and radio reception faded into static. Neither man knew that Elias had memorized this route months earlier during another medical appointment. He knew the curves, the blind spots, the dead zones, everything. Inside the van, Elias sat chained at the wrists, ankles, and waist. But the officers didn't know the truth. One of the restraints had been loosened days earlier during a staged fight in his cell. A guard had rushed the restraint process, locking one shackle a notch too high. Elias felt that looseness. He remembered it. And now he was ready to use it. For the first 20 minutes, Elias remained perfectly still, breathing slowly, eyes half closed, pretending to be sedated from the medication they had forced him to take. But the dose was weak, intentionally spilled earlier by Elias when the nurse looked away. He wanted them to believe he was weak. He wanted them to let their guard down. The van slowed as it approached a sharp curve, the exact point where Elias knew Officer Hale always unbuckled his seatbelt to reach the files behind him. It was predictable. It was perfect. As the van leaned into the curve, Hale twisted to grab the paperwork. And Elias struck. He snapped the loose wrist chain against the metal railing, breaking free with a violent crack that echoed through the van. Hale barely had time to lift his head before Elias lunged forward, driving his shoulder into the officer's chest. The van swerved wildly as Bennett shouted in panic, trying to regain control. Inside the cramped space, it was a storm of fists, chains, and desperate movements. Hale fought back, but Elias was fueled by years of rage and a single opportunity he refused to lose. He slammed Hale's head into the steel wall, grabbing the man's holster before he could even scream. Bennett stopped the van, reaching for his radio, but Elias was already behind him. The prisoner pulled him backward with terrifying force, using the officer's own seatbelt to choke him into unconsciousness. Hale managed one final act of bravery, pressing the emergency beacon button with a trembling hand. But by the time backup received the signal, it was too late. Elias stepped out of the van, dragging Hale with him. The struggle ended in seconds. A single, fatal blow. A silence that swallowed the forest whole. By the time police arrived, the van was empty. Hale was gone. Bennett was barely alive. And Elias Ward had disappeared into the night. A killer, free again. The moment Officer Hale's emergency beacon hit dispatch, the peaceful rural county exploded into chaos. Within minutes, the quiet night sky filled with helicopter blades cutting through the darkness. Patrol cars roared down empty roads with sirens off, because this wasn't a normal escape, and officers didn't want to scare Elias deeper into hiding. They wanted silence. They wanted precision. They wanted him cornered before he vanished completely. The officer's death changed everything. This was no longer a search. This was a manhunt for a cop killer, and every officer involved knew Elias Ward would not be taken easily. State troopers were the first to arrive. They found the van abandoned on the side of the road, doors open, lights still flashing. Officer Bennett lay unconscious but alive. Officer Hale, the veteran who had survived decades of dangerous duty, did not. His body was found just beyond the tree line, and the scene told a chilling story. Elias hadn't just run. He had fought. He had killed. And he had done it with the cold precision of a man who knew time was his only enemy. The county went into immediate lockdown. Schools were closed. Residents were ordered to stay inside and turn on their porch lights. Drones scanned farmland and creeks. K9 units followed scent trails that twisted through mud, over fences, and into dense forest. But every trail ended in the same frustrating way. Suddenly, sharply, as if Elias had simply evaporated. But he hadn't. He was moving with a plan. Elias had spent years studying police response patterns. He knew the grid search method they used. He knew how long it took for perimeter units to form. He even knew where the thermal cameras struggled to detect body heat, swamps, industrial pipes, and deep drainage tunnels. And so that's exactly where he went. By the time officers widened their perimeter, Elias was miles away, crawling through a drainage ditch, soaked in mud, stripped of his prison jumpsuit. He broke into a nearby tool shed, stealing dark clothing, gloves, and a flashlight. He ate from a farmer's storage freezer. He washed his face in a horse trough. He moved like a ghost, silent, fast, and terrifyingly smart. Meanwhile, the news spread like wildfire. Cop killer on the loose. Armed and extremely dangerous. Stay inside. Do not approach. Photos of Elias's face appeared on every phone, every news channel, every social media feed. But that didn't make the search easier. It made him harder to find. He now knew exactly how big the manhunt was. By the second day, hundreds of officers were involved. FBI, U.S. Marshals, state police, and tactical teams. They searched barns, abandoned silos, creek beds, scrapyards, and isolated cabins. Tips flooded in, sightings, rumors, shadows. Most were false, but every tip kept officers moving, exhausted, tense, and desperate. Elias watched it all from a distance. From a ridge above the forest, he saw helicopters slicing through the night. He heard canines barking in the distance. He saw the fear he had created, and for a moment he smiled. A cold, cruel smile of a man who believed he had already won. But even the smartest criminals make one mistake, and Elias was about to make his. By the third night, the manhunt had reached a breaking point. Officers were exhausted, K9 units were worn out, and even the helicopters were being rotated to prevent mechanical failure. But Elias Ward was still out there, still moving, still staying one miserable step ahead of hundreds of trained professionals. And that alone drove law enforcement into a state of obsession. They knew time was running out. A man like Elias wouldn't hide forever. Eventually, he would strike again. They had to stop him before that happened. Just before dawn, a call came in from a gas station 3 towns away. A security camera had captured a tall man moving behind the dumpsters, limping slightly, wrapped in a dark jacket pulled over his face. The footage was blurry, just a few seconds long, but the limp caught the attention of investigators. Elias had injured his leg during the initial escape. The match was enough. Police didn't announce the lead. They didn't alert the news. Instead, they quietly moved in, forming a perimeter around a 2-mile industrial zone filled with warehouses, abandoned mechanic shops, and rusted trailers. It was the perfect place for someone like Elias to disappear into. Teams moved silently, using night vision and drones while officers checked every shadow. For nearly 2 hours, they found nothing, just empty buildings and old equipment. But then, a drone picked up something unusual. A faint heat signature inside a warehouse that was supposed to be condemned. It was small, barely detectable, as if someone was trying to stay still to avoid thermal detection. Someone who knew exactly how police hunted fugitives. The tactical team approached, moving like shadows across the broken concrete. They set up silently, surrounding the building with rifles raised. The lead officer gave the signal. The breach was explosive. Officers stormed inside, their lights slicing through the darkness. The warehouse was a maze of broken pallets, rusted machinery, and shattered windows. And then they saw him. Elias Ward, crouched behind a stack of crates, clutching a metal rod, eyes wild with the same cold fury he had carried his entire life. He didn't surrender, not even for a second. With a roar, Elias charged forward, swinging the metal rod with brutal force. Officers dodged, returning non-lethal rounds that slammed into his body. But Elias kept coming, driven by survival and rage. He knocked one officer to the ground, attempted to disarm another, and grabbed for a broken piece of machinery as if it were a weapon. It took 8 trained tactical officers to bring him down. They tackled him hard, pinning his arms, chaining his ankles, securing a reinforced mask over his face to prevent spitting or biting. Elias struggled until his strength finally gave out, muscles trembling, breath ragged. Even then, even in defeat, he stared at them with the cold, lifeless glare of a man who felt no fear, no regret, no remorse. Outside the warehouse, dozens of officers watched as Elias was dragged out in full restraints, surrounded by armed guards on every side. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. The entire nation saw the moment the nightmare finally ended. But this wasn't triumph. This was relief, because Elias Ward was captured, but the damage he left behind would haunt the country forever. The capture of Elias Ward ended the manhunt, but it did not end the nightmare he left behind. In the days that followed, the nation replayed every second of the hunt on screens, phones, news alerts, and late-night broadcasts. People watched the footage of Elias being dragged out of the warehouse in chains, his face masked, his body bruised, yet his eyes still cold and unrepentant. For many, that moment became a symbol of justice. For others, it was a reminder of how close the country had come to absolute disaster. Officer Hale's funeral was held 3 days after Elias was returned to custody. Hundreds of officers lined the streets, saluting as the flag-draped casket passed. Hale had been a father, a husband, and a respected veteran who had survived years of danger only to fall victim to the one prisoner no one could predict. His family spoke through tears about his dedication, his bravery, and his belief that every life is worth protecting. But the hardest part, the part no one said out loud, was knowing that Hale had died while protecting a man who had never valued a single life in his own. Inside the prison system, Elias was placed under the highest level of security ever used on a single inmate. He was moved to a specialized, isolated unit designed for terrorists and uncontrollable violent offenders. His cell had no loose bolts, no removable fixtures, no bars he could bend. Every meal was delivered through a secure slot. Every movement was restrained. Every interaction was monitored. The prison had learned from its mistake. This time, they would not underestimate him. Investigators spent weeks retracing Elias's steps during the escape. How had he noticed the loose shackle? How did he know the transport route? How had he evaded hundreds of officers for 3 days? The answers were chilling. Elias had planned everything. Every fight in prison, every silent observation, every manipulation of guards. It had all been preparation for his moment to escape. His entire life behind bars was a long, quiet rehearsal for the violence he unleashed on that night. The sheriff in charge of the manhunt later admitted something on live television that shocked the country. We weren't looking for a fugitive. We were hunting a predator. The public reaction was divided. Some praised the police for capturing a man as dangerous as Elias without further loss of life. Others demanded answers. How could such a prisoner be transported by only 2 officers? Why wasn't security tighter? Why wasn't the danger taken seriously sooner? Politicians argued. News panels raged. Experts debated. Everyone had a theory. No one had a solution. Meanwhile, Elias showed no emotion during court hearings. He sat in silence as prosecutors laid out the charges: escape, assault, attempted murder, and the killing of Officer Hale. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Elias simply looked up, expression blank, and whispered, "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Those words froze the courtroom. Elias Ward was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, an existence of steel, silence, and total isolation. But even behind the thickest walls in America, one fear lingered among the officers who had chased him. A man like Elias doesn't need freedom to be dangerous. He only needs time, and time is something prison will give him plenty of.